Though the Klenk had already sent an expedition to the edge of human space and had to tangle with a small force of human militia, and because of that they lost dramatically, they turned and looked to another possible area where they could expand their forces. Their empire wanted to expand beyond its own borders and keep spreading out, but they believed that the only way to spread out and actually have control over the area was not through diplomatic means, but through conquering. Everyone understood this. On many of their borders, other species had already brought in many, many defensive measures to stop the Clank from actually reaching into their borders and taking entire planets, entire sectors even. So the Clank only had one option, really: to go into the border region where humans were. Humans were mixed with another species called the Quintaris. These Quintaris were a relatively peaceful species, more akin to support than actual fighters. Yet they would throw down if necessary, plus, their technology would be a great interest to the Clank, as the Clank and the Quintaris don't think the same way, and Quintara's prisoners have been shown to be extremely valuable when it comes to increasing the lethality of their weapons, the speed of their ships, the durability of everything, and of course, making sure that they were the pinnacle of the galaxy. So they looked towards a sector called Davis. Davis 5 was the planet that would be chosen. It was the most highly populated planet in that sector, even though there was actually 3 planets that were populated. They believed taking out the strongest one first would allow them to take out the 2 smaller planets without much issue, and if possible, it would force the other 2 colony worlds to simply surrender. This would give them the planet and the personnel on it without any loss to themselves. A completely logical way of thinking. The only question was, would the humans do anything? A cursory evaluation showed that there was about the same amount of humans as before on planet, and this was something of concern. In response, instead of sending 270,000 personnel, they would be sending almost 5 million, scattered across 1 major command ship, 28 cruiser class, 31 destroyers, 102 frigates, and their associate aerospace fighters. They believed this would be able to overrun anything with just sheer numbers, and they'd be able to get their people on the ground, and they knew once they got them on the ground, there was no way that even humans could stand up. It wouldn't be possible. Humans may be big, but they wouldn't be able to stand up against that many, could they? It stood to reason they would be able to again take them over just by overwhelming force. As they entered the solar system, they realized that there was no actual fleet. The small defense ships that were there initially lined up to defend the planet, but before the Clank even got close, they seemed to disappear off in the ether. Everyone wondered about this, but the command insisted that they must keep moving forward and take this planet as quickly as possible. If they have control of the planet when any reinforcements arrive, they can dispute the legality that they already have any type of control, any claim to the planet. The Clank needed to do this quickly, as it was legal once the planet surrendered to their control. Any other forces trying to take it back would be seen as an invasion force, not a liberation. That was galactic law. As they made their way towards the planet, they immediately took out the satellites, which barely scraped any of the cruisers or destroyers. As they started to aim towards the planet, they got their frigates in location and began to make sure that their landing area was clear. They could see the same type of tractors moving around, and they made sure that these would be targeted this time. But there was others, smaller ones, seeming to move on simple wheels. Other ones seemed to be moving almost on animals. Other ones on vehicles so small that only 2 little wheels would push them around. Other ones used some sort of hover or repulsor technology to move themselves around. This was not going to be an empty drop zone. And of course, for 5 million, you would need at least a semi-empty drop zone. With this many personnel, you'd be able to just simply wipe the floor with everyone else. As many of the frigates started their first wave towards the ground, covered by every single aerospace fighter, they realized suddenly there might be something wrong. Again, there was no fire. They knew that the humans would hold their fire until everyone was inside the atmosphere. The galactic law did not allow them to actually fire down from above the atmosphere itself. This gave the defenders a fighting chance. Yet, with this many, it wouldn't matter. And the Klenk knew it. They may lose a lot, but they will gain an entire world, and that was the importance. As the first wave of frigates got about halfway down, they were again bombarded from all sides. Different launchers began to come up, targeting not only their fighters, but their destroyers and frigates as well. The destroyers were barely inside the atmosphere, but tried to hold as best they could. This planet had a much, much stronger gravity well than they were used to, which meant that almost all their energy was dedicated to make sure the engines were running and make sure they did not end up in a forced landing. That was something they didn't want. It was bad enough the frigates were the only ones that could land and land the heavy equipment down. Yet they knew that this was going to be a hell of a bumpy ride. There might have been just as many humans, but it seemed like they had more weapons, and they seemed to be ready. As missiles, rockets started to creep across the sky. Also, was a strange bright light. It seemed almost like a small red dot would be flying across the sky as well, many of them, falling one after another, about a second and a quarter apart from each other. Many of the fighters tried to weave in and out and then suddenly found out that their aircraft were starting to get riddled with holes. They didn't quite understand it at first, as their sensors were not quite picking it up. They picked up the heat corona from those bright red ones, but they didn't know what else was hitting them, and many a fighter started spinning out of control when the pilot was forced to eject to make sure that they were not torn apart on the way down. Though landing would be a very big issue. Though it was high gravity, it was also denser atmosphere, which did help a lot, but the landing was still not going to be fun for anyone. As they finally got their frigates within a quarter distance from the outer atmosphere to the surface, alarms in the main ship started to go off. The captain simply said, "Now what?" as he looked towards the surface. But this time it wasn't his ground-based radar that was going off. He realized that it was the proximity alarm from other ships entering. He immediately started to tell all his ships to get ready for an assault outside the atmosphere and recalled half of his destroyers up towards the outer atmosphere and then beyond to break from the gravity well so they could join the battle. As they turned, they realized that humanity was no longer playing. They no longer left themselves out there for simply a militia to maintain the planet. What they saw horrified them. Humans, known for their ability to bring a large force rather quickly, but this was beyond what they believed. They didn't realize that a force this large could be close, comprised of a single dreadnought class. This would be enough to store 6 of their own battleships inside, yet still had enough weapons as though it was a floating battle station. 4 battleships flanked it on each side, along with 20 destroyers and 16 frigates. It seemed as though they didn't care about launching their fighters, and then they watched as it's like the fighters came out from the back end. It was almost as though these frigates and destroyers and battleships were simply giving birth to entire swarms of fighters, yet the fighters did not fully engage. It's like they didn't want to get close. This was the moment that the Klenk commander realized he might have just fucked up. They were given one warning to withdraw the forces immediately or they would be destroyed. The Klenk commander looked through the database to find the biggest insult he could, and yet he didn't quite understand it. As he tried to translate it through, he sent the message, "Consume a male sexual organ." With that, They began to move closer to get themselves within optimal range to fire, but they wouldn't get the chance. The human weapons simply turned, adjusted slightly, and then began to race all sorts of hell across the Klenk armada. Their destroyers could last for a single hit if they weren't hit absolutely direct, but their frigates, anyone still left in space that is, were simply cut to ribbons by the large caliber weapons flying. The main ship tried desperately to use evasive maneuvers to try and not get struck. Catching a couple glancing blows was the best they could. The helmsman was doing everything he could to make sure that he could not be hit by the incoming ordnance and also not kill the crew inside the ship with high G maneuvers. With this, the Klenk began to go full burn towards the humans. They believed that if they could get close enough, they could get within optimal range and bring all sorts of fire. Even though they had more ships, it seemed as though the humans had one or two much larger ones. The Klenk main ship was accustomed to two battleships as far as humans were concerned. The cruisers matched about one battleship apiece, at least Klenk to human standards. The humans almost seemed to enjoy what they were doing. The fighters still sat there, waiting for their turn to go in, waiting patiently out in the ether as the large weapons began to fire and swing, the turrets moving each of their cannons up and down as they made their way towards their target and began to fire. The distance between all of them was absolutely insane. But what others didn't realize is there was something else coming besides the main guns. The main guns were there to mess up the formation. The formation of Klenk finally got within range and started maneuver their weapons, and then they saw something they really, really wish they didn't. Self-propelled ordnance fired from not only every destroyer, every frigate and battleship, but also from every fighter that was simply waiting. The fighters seemed to be firing half of their ordnance, waiting until they got another target after the strike, and then they would target another one and fire. This seemed to be the practice that every single ship was doing, and the Klenk armada started to rip itself to pieces. As they began to fire their main guns, they began to clip a few of the human destroyers and frigates. They were desperately trying not to get hit, as destroyers may be covered in guns, but they do not have the armor of a battleship. And they didn't bring any cruisers with them. The frigates, too, pulled back to the second line, many of them just not having the tonnage to take a slugfest fight like this. The battleships and dreadnoughts began to move ever so closer, moving the formation more into a cone shape, with the dreadnought at the front. The Klenk, surprisingly, did the same thing, and decided to get as close as they could. If they couldn't outrange the humans, then perhaps they could get in and take them down. Perhaps the humans weren't good at point-blank fighting. On the bridge, the XO of the dreadnought looked over to his commander and stated how the Klenk were beginning to charge at them. The captain, in a low voice, simply said, "Good. Let them get close, get personal. We can take it." With that, they decided to go at full burn of the dreadnought, the slowest of the ships, and told all the rest to keep up and stay in formation as best they can, even though they still had to go in evasive maneuvers, trying desperately not to get slammed. They were able to make it. The Klenk forces, still being tore up, did not stop. Those on the ground were not doing much better. Now that they no longer had cover from their destroyers, they were sitting ducks. The ordnance that was coming across the ground was not only guided munitions, but it was also dumbfire munitions fired from over several dozen kilometers away. They couldn't understand it. As soon as they touched the ground, it seemed as though the ground itself would start exploding around them. Explosions would rock the top of the frigate as they were trying to get their heavy weapons out. The heavy weapons, and more often than not, couldn't get out as the ramp itself would end up being destroyed the moment it opened. With that, the human vehicles on the far end would suddenly start firing guided munitions right into the hold, and with that, the heavy vehicles started to explode, causing a chain reaction that would blow the frigate to pieces, usually leaving it unable to take flight ever again. This was a bloodbath. As one person said, a good old-fashioned turkey shoot. And considering the Klenk looked like a cybernetic version of some sort of bird and octopus, it kind of worked. And this made many people laugh. On the ground, they also tried to charge the humans, believing if they can get close enough, they wouldn't be able to use their heavier munitions. They did get close, and then they realized that the humans started screaming this strange war cry. And they would find that this war cry would be the scariest thing they would ever hear from humans, especially in the middle of a battle. Fix bayonets! They all wondered what the hell that meant. And within 20 seconds, the humans charged the line of the Klenk. The Klenk believed since they were cybernetic, they'd be able to take down the humans. Then they realized that the humans, many of them, were wearing power armor. Oh shit. Along with that, exosuits on many of them. Not all of them, but those that were there designed to take a whole bunch of hits and bring out a whole bunch of hurt as well. This left the Klenk infantry fighting tooth and nail just to survive, many of them suddenly dropping their weapons, saying nope and getting the hell out, trying desperately to reach one of the few frigates that hadn't been totally destroyed, screaming at their brethren to get on the ship and take flight as soon as possible. It was though the humans were having a bit of mercy as this one frigate was being loaded up. As it was immediately getting loaded, it seemed like the human infantry had held back and they were going to let the Klenk escape, as maybe a gesture of goodwill. Then something happened the Klenk were not ready for. The metal birds, the fighters, the in-atmosphere fighters that were being used by the humans screamed over the battlefield, many of them barely several dozen meters above the ground, suddenly spiked up as hard as they could, brought their nose down, and then fired their munitions as fast as they could. Some of them in the second wave would let out some of the worst sounds you ever heard. You would hear the metallic rip through the hull of the frigate, making it inviable as either the bridge or the engine was hit. And as you heard that, you heard the worst sound after. It was enough that many of the Klenk just sat there and began to pray, waited for death, as they realized that running away from an enemy was punishable by death in the Empire, if not life imprisonment. They knew that if they were captured, they were most likely dead as well. But how could they fight against this? And as the last frigate was grounded, many of them simply dropped their weapons, dropped to the ground, and waited to be executed. In space, the main ship of the Klenk was being torn to ribbons. As good as the helmsman was, nobody is that good. And eventually, the main ship turned into a hulk that was just drifting aimlessly towards the human dreadnought. The dreadnought had to order that the entire formation break apart so that they could get out of the way before the main ship crashed into them. If this actually happened, I don't care how good your dreadnought is, it's not going to be in the fight ever again. The battleships tried desperately to strike the main ship of the Klenk to try and get its trajectory away, but to no avail. It was just too big, too bulky, and too many holes in it, as they were so close now that there was absolutely nothing that would stop them from hitting it. But then again, there was nothing for them to hit. They would simply knock small fragments off and make it tumble even more. The few cruisers that remained simply turned, did a flip and burn, and tried desperately to get away from the human fleet. The few destroyers that remained followed them, and there was absolutely no frigates left. The two cruisers, along with 9 destroyers, jumped into FTL out of the area, completely, absolutely horrified at what had happened. As they waited in the next sector, just inside their territory, the commander of one of the cruisers took command of the remaining battle group and tried to figure out what in the hell just happened. And as they sent across the streams to the entire remainder of the fleet, They started taking stock of how much they had lost and how many humans they had taken down. In actuality, they had done not too bad. When it came to the human frigates, they had knocked at least a quarter of them out of the action, if not completely. That left only 12 remaining. At least 3 destroyers were out of action, fully adrift. However, they didn't know if they were completely out of it. The battleships, though damaged, they were still in the fight completely. The dreadnought itself, they didn't know if there was enough damage done to it. It was the primary target of every single one of their shots and did take some pretty hefty hits. However, the fact that it could maneuver out of the way of the Klenk's main ship before they jumped out meant that it was still in the fight. All in all, they had lost far too many to continue it. And the logic dictates that they must report this no matter what. No matter the consequences, they must report it back to make sure that they do not make this mistake a third time. And as they started to get ready to jump again, one of the destroyer captains sent to the cruiser asking, "Wait a minute, are we at least out of range of the humans now?" Suddenly, an alarm went off, and before they knew it, human ships came out of FTL almost on top of them. As though they had been monitoring the communications, they received one word: "Nope." After the battle was over, the few Klenk prisoners that had surrendered on the ground were taken for interrogation. This was tantamount to a declaration of war. The human ambassadors were irate at the idea that the Klenk had actually decided to play this game. They wanted to go to war with the humans, and the Klenk ambassador was scared out of his mind. For logical thinking people, he visibly shook at the idea that humanity would actually call for war against them, as they had seen that they could not even manage to take down a quarter of a human battle group. Yet they wondered this might have been their main fleet. And in an act of defiance, they looked up to the humans and stated that because they had taken down part of the humans' main fleet, they knew they had nothing to fear from the humans, not to mention the Klenk territory was massive compared to the humans, and they could simply build far more ships and take them down based on attrition. The humans looked at each other and grinned. Main fleet? Are you drunk, high, or stupid? That was a battle group. You want to see the main fleet? Why don't you look at this planet? Moving his fingers across his data pad, he clicked on one area, and then everyone could see. There was a video of not just one battle group, but over a dozen of them tearing apart a Klenk fleet just outside one of their main worlds. The Klenk didn't have any chance. The humans had come this time for blood, and they wanted some of it, and they were going to get it. The Klenk ambassador, towards the end of the fleet, laughed again. "There are 18 billion on this world. How do you plan on defeating them all and take the planet?" "Who the fuck said we wanted the planet? You might want to keep watching." With this, the Klenk ambassador looked as several of the dreadnoughts and battleships turned towards the planet itself and began to streak energy weapons across them, going right down the fault lines, overheating them to the point where they began to rupture and split, causing massive eruptions on a planet that was tectonically solid. Suddenly, massive earthquakes shook the land with such force that entire mountain ranges began to shudder. Massive supervolcanoes, along with all the small ones that were still active, began to explode across the planet. The Klenk ambassador dropped to its knees with a sudden clank of the metal legs. It looked over to the humans with sheer shock and horror. How Could you? The human ambassador simply stood up tall and proud so that everyone could see, and then stated, "You all know of humanity as a kind race, as ones that will help out our neighbors without question. We go over to the Klenk, and we have saved entire worlds from starvation. You go over to the Fonga, and you can ask them how we brace their economy back up from the brink of collapse, from an entire struggle that could have ended their entire species. We will always help. However, you made one big fucking mistake. You confused our kindness with weakness. We humans have been killing each other for millennia now. We know how to fight. And because we go by a certain set of rules ourselves for war, we offered that to you. I'm sure you remember. The Klenk, who were still on their feet, began to go through their own sort of data pad as they looked on the round viewport that was there. And they realized that yes, there was a document. And they remembered, as they searched their own database, that they refused to sign. They thought these rules were silly. They were stupid. It was basically the same thing, yet it said that you couldn't fire down on a civilian population unless that civilian population was being used as a basically meat shield, a living shield against the weapons. Then it would be unfortunate, but shield would not hold. So civilian populations and religious sites were not to be used ever. They refused to sign this, as this was against their own doctrine. And now they regretted it. As the rest of the Klenk trembled, several of the other nations, the other species, that is, would reach up and sign the documentation, as they did not want to make the same mistake the Klenk did. The Klenk themselves offered to sign the document right there, as they didn't know what else to do, in any case, to stop this battle. The humans simply laughed. Are you fucking kidding me? You invade two of our worlds and just start randomly shooting down on usually a farm town, killing God knows how many, and now you want us to go by other rules? No. You wanted total war. Congratulations. This is how we play this fucking game. It was then that one of the Klenk ambassadors, with a strange look on his face as though he had figured something out, screamed out how humanity had fired from orbit, breaking the rules of war, and now they should be the enemy of the entirety of the galaxy. And that's when the humans snapped back. If you remember, since you didn't sign our rules of war, we didn't sign yours, dick. That is when the Klenk started looking through their information again, and sure enough, humans have never been a signatory. With that, they realized how deep they truly were, and began to beg the humans for forgiveness. Yet this was a ruse, a complete falsehood. As one of them begged the humans to try and stop them from anything, they began to contact their entire fleet from every single sector at the same time. If the humans were going to fight, they would aim for the human homeworld itself. And as their fleets began to move within the 2 minutes that it took for this to be sent out, the humans seemed to all stop and look at their own data pads and read what was there. And then they all looked at each other and began to grin and chuckle. You really think that's a good idea? Going after our home planet? With that, the Klenk ambassador stood up again tall and proud. You threaten our entire species, so we threaten yours. Your fleet is no way capable of reaching our planets and saving yours at the same time. You are too far away. You thought that was all of them. That is when the Klenk went completely pale. One of the ambassadors actually fainted as it looked on its own datasphere. The others looked with sheer horror as they realized that the battle fleets were only a small portion of what humanity had. How? 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 Simple. Remember when I said that humans been at war with each other? Well, we don't trust each other. We trust your feathery ass a whole lot less. The Klenk then began to beg again for forgiveness and started contacting their own government trying to ask for surrender. Yet this was only responded to by the imperial family by simply stating that those emissaries were no longer emissaries and they would have someone else installed. And the idea that humanity was strong enough to take out an entire planet in just a few hours was a simple rumor. There is no possibility of it. They said that what they found on the videos was simple propaganda. This was a fake. There's no way they could do it. They could not possibly have ships with this much destructive capabilities. How could they possibly bring that many ships? It didn't make sense. It didn't pass the logic of what they had. And the ambassadors again begged the royal family. This once again fell on deaf ears, and everyone in the council chambers watched as the ambassadors of the Klenk held their dataspheres. The communications cut off, and they simply shook as they looked over at the humans. One of the humans looked at them and simply stated, "Y'all might want to go back and tell them to rethink that, because by the time you get there, you'll have lost another half a dozen worlds. So my suggestion, get." And with that, the Clank ambassadors, as fast as their cybernetic legs could move, shuffled out of the council chambers. As was stated before, by the time they even got back to their home planet, another half a dozen systems were completely wiped clean of their own people. The royal family was still in disbelief. Many of them couldn't understand how this could even be possible, how they could lose communications. And as the ambassadors got on their knees and begged for the royal family to please, finally give peace to the humans and surrender, or they will all perish, the pride of that royal family would not stop them. And the death march of the humans cut a swath right into the heart of their territory, aiming straight for the home planet. And only when multiple human battle groups came into the sector and sent hundreds of hulks of their own destroyers, the Clank, watching their own destroyers and frigates crash onto the ground, some of them in major markets and large cities, killing untold numbers of their own kind. Yet, humanity had come with such overwhelming force that a war of attrition would have been foolish in the first place. It was then and only then that the royal family made communications with the humans. They simply asked, "What do you want?" "Well, we wanted to be left alone, but apparently you don't understand the concept of that. So we're going to take these worlds here," a map showing up in front of the royal family, "over 3 dozen sectors into Clank territory. We're going to take them. They're part of our territory now. And if you ever even think about entering our territory again, I don't care it's for commerce, trading in goods, or trading in your ass. We don't want to know you. You will stay on your side of the border forever." To everyone's shock, the royal family actually got down on their knees in a position of surrender and agreed to these terms. And with the signing of the documents, no lavish ceremony, simply sign the documents and send them up, and swear to never, ever enter human space again. Humanity simply turned their guns away, turned their ships away, and went back. Later in the council chamber, the Klenk were never there. They had totally been removed from the Galactic Council as everyone was tired of their bullshit. And the fact that they had surrendered to humans showed that there was a new badass on the block that nobody wanted to screw with. Yet one of the humans' allies simply asked a question of humanity: why didn't they exterminate the Klenk? The response was simple: it would take too fucking long, and we have planets to terraform. They all looked at each other in complete awe, and yet they realized that the Klenk had control over another several hundred systems. And now, so did humanity. And they had to repair all the systems that had been torn apart by war. And this would take a long time and a lot of resources. Yet it was amazing to see the ugly human ships, almost like a flying brick, land on the planets, and within several weeks begin to fully terraform the entire world. It was amazing to the rest of the universe. And eventually, the Klenk would become nothing more than a footnote, and almost a myth in human society. As true to their word, they stayed as far away from humans as possible, because they wanted, above all else, to get out of range of the human weapons.